My name is Carl Quo, and this is Founder Quest, a podcast about the journeys of starting a game studio. I met Mickael through the local development community in Vancouver, Canada. He's one of the founders of Caldera Interactive, which spun up in 2019. As you'll hear, Caldera really came together in the classic game industry fable way of folks who want to make games, doing it on the side, then make a play to do it full-time and succeed. In this case, the play was applying for the Canadian Media Fund, or CMF. I wanted Mickael to come on and share his story so that folks could hear about how local ecosystem funding can be a source as much as the classic tales of publishers and VCs. It's not an easy road, but it is a viable one. Let's jump in. All right. So what I always like to start out with is there was some moment when you were like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to start a game studio. I'm going to get it off the ground and get going. What led up to that moment that made you choose to found a studio?
I was lucky in that I had a bit of time to come to that. So when we started the studio, myself and my co-founders, we were somewhat out of school and we were doing it part-time. So kind of got to like the idea that like, oh, maybe we could do this, but it's part-time, so it's really just dipping the toe. Um, Over time, we essentially had the opportunity to go full-time with it because we found some funding. And that's really, by then it was like I had been doing web development for about 5 years. I was still fairly young, fairly fresh out of school. I was like, well, if not now, then when? The whole point of me going into computer science was video game from the start. I had kind of strayed from that path, and it seemed like, well, this is the perfect opportunity. I have a team of people that I trust. There's funding to go full time. Web development is not going anywhere. If I don't do this now, then when else? What else am I waiting for? So it was kind of that decision was easy to get used to for me.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing, like, sort of, I think the idea of dipping your toes into it and being able to do it part-time and get a grip on what it actually is even before you fully commit is really cool. And I think that's a great way to sort of build trust and confidence with the team. Once you were like, okay, we're gonna have the funding to do this full time, and like, to what you said, why not now? What was the thing that you're like, oh God, now I have to learn all of these things, right? Like, what was the learning curve after that moment?
Yeah, that's a funny story to it too, because originally the team had a lot more founders, but as time went on and we weren't getting traction with the previous prototypes, a bunch of the people that we had appointed as like the leads on like for the company sort of moved on, and so the rest of us were there and like, oh, okay, we got funding, we like each other, well, okay, let's try and do this. And then it's that thing of like, oh right, you're not just supposed to make a game, there's this whole business side to it. um, so that was the biggest um, thing that we had to figure out by then. It was just like, okay, the person that we had thought was going to deal with like the budgeting and like getting in touch with the lawyers and like all the boring stuff that's not the game development, we're like, okay, well now we have to go and figure that out. And that was the biggest learning curve of yeah, just all the little business things that would later come back and bite us because we didn't do properly the first time. uh, but again, I was lucky in that we had worked together for a while, so we also knew when to give each other the space to figure that out. We're all learning, so if mistakes happen, as long as the whole thing doesn't come collapsing, we're okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So yeah, it was the business side stuff that was the biggest learning curve, I'd say.
Yeah, how did you go about digging into that? I know that my first crash course into lawyers and biz dev and budgets and spreadsheets was a like falling down, the old cartoons where you fall down the well and you're just hitting every pipe and stick along the way. That's what learning it for me felt like. But I'm curious, like, how did you're faced with this idea, like, I have to learn how to do this. How did you in particular go on the journey of, like, okay, I'm going to do this and this and this and this to try and learn all these things?
Well, so luckily through the funding that we got, part of the application kind of forces you through thinking about these things, whether it's having a go-to lawyer or accountant, or even like the marketing for your game and how you want to position yourself. That's all part of the application. So some of those ideas were there. Uh, from then on, it's really just reaching out to my network of peers to know, okay, have you ever had to think about this? Do you know someone who could direct me to someone? And just through reference, essentially figuring out the like, okay, that lawyer. I understand lawyers are expensive, more expensive than I thought, but you want a good lawyer,
Mm-hmm.
because if you don't, and we tried both avenues of like cheaper lawyers, and we we saw the mistake that was. Uh, so yeah, luckily it's a bit of like that application told us some of the things that we weren't thinking about, so we had leads on that, and then from then on, it's just picking up basically any articles that talks about the founder's journey, the like how to build a game business, all these things, and just finding little clues here and there, listening to a lot of podcasts to help us figure out like what are the things that we don't even know to think about. But yeah.
Awesome. I want to actually jump ahead because you sort of mentioned in passing, that you guys got fundraising and it was part of this application and it was part of this very different way of getting fundraising. And one of the reasons why I was really excited to have you as a guest was to talk through this. And so, just to spoil it, you're funded by the Canadian Media Fund, often called a CMF, and so you're actually funded through grants, functionally, right? And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that was like, how you sort of decided to go about that. And, for our listeners who are maybe not as familiar with the CMF process and what it entails, maybe talk a little bit about that journey of applying for and then getting the CMF.
Yeah, so at the time we had applied for it, we had heard that their terms were really good. For the fund that got us started on full time, it was a prototype fund, so not for full production. um, we had just heard that it's pretty good money, that as far as repayment, it's also very lenient, which would be very good for us being starting developers and whatnot. Um, and I mean, hearing from that, really, it was like pretty much this money is pretty good money. The market was still pretty good, so we could have tried to go for publishers, which was still the plan. But really, it was let's apply for this thing. If we get it, we have no excuse but to go full time, because the part time work was dragging, and give this a real shot. So that's the thing that could give us. I'm sure if we had gone to the VC route or even the publisher route, given our past experience, we were going to have trouble convincing someone to trust us with all that money. And I understand it; they got to de-risk it, and it's a business, it's not a charity. So in that way, the CMF seemed like a good avenue for us. And the process, as far as the process goes, um, it's a pretty difficult process, because it's a lot of government paperwork, and they do highlight some of the guidelines. But the thing with the CMF is that there's an infinite amount of secret tricks, uh, that you only get to know if you know someone to tell you about the secret trick. Which usually a lot of that knowledge is concentrated on the East Coast.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but somehow we managed to get it. Honestly, looking back at that application, I'm so shocked that it worked out. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, since then we've gone on to get other rounds of funding from them for another prototype. So that first prototype that got us into full time work, we abandoned
Mm-hmm.
and applied for um, new prototyping in production for our current project.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, that I can't even like measure how helpful that first grant was in getting us full time because it really allowed us to just try things out. It
Mhm.
allowed us to think that like, oh, okay, so we've got some money now. All right, let's work on a dinky little prototype. We think we know how marketing works. We think we know how pitching to publisher works. And our idea is definitely not overscoped, which it definitely was. A multiplayer game with a one programmer team was not a smart idea. Um, but in that year of prototyping this and pitching it to publishers, which again, massively lucky that through our network we found ways to pitch to publishers that like uh, thinking back on it, I'm not even sure why they took our meeting. It's crazy. Like devolvers and things like that where our prototype was so early. I guess maybe the pitch was good enough to convince them. Uh, but yeah, that period of time essentially taught us so much and allowed us to do it on the CMF money, so that the next time around when we applied for a new prototype, we were way ahead of the game in terms of how we should be thinking about this as a business, how we should be pitching it,
Mhm.
um, our contacts that could help us get to where we need to be in the right rooms and the right discussions. So the CMF was massively helpful.
And so, just again, sort of trying to make it a little bit clear for listeners not familiar. For CMF, you can apply for multiple rounds for different, basically, development stages. So you apply for prototype, and then you apply for production. Are there any other moments that you can apply for CMF, or are those the two major distinctions?
Those are the major ones. There's one right before prototyping called conceptualization
Mm-hmm.
that you can apply for. It's a much smaller amount of money,
Mm-hmm.
but it can help you get you concept art done, refining the pitch, not really working on the game per
Mm-hmm.
se, but the all the stuff that comes before actually starting a prototype. The CMF has a lot of other programs that one may or may not be eligible depending on their criterias, but those three are the major ones for sure.
Cool. And if you're comfortable sharing, because I'm not sure how much it's a fixed amount versus a project by project amount. What is the scope of funding for the product or for the prototyping and production grants?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all that stuff's public information.
Okay,
So
great.
um, for prototyping, it's $250,000, and for production, it's up to 1.5 million. But the 1.5 million uh, also includes if you had gotten prototype money.
Mm.
So yeah, in total, the CMF will put up to 1.5 million into your project.
And just at this point, we're just satisfying my own curiosity. It's Canadian dollars, I assume,
Yes,
since
yeah, that's
Canadian. Yeah,
important.
yeah,
Yeah, that can that's fair. Yeah, that's a good question. It's
yeah,
all
yeah.
Canadian dollars. I wish it was US, but I'm not gonna
Yeah.
complain.
It's weird how the Canadian government doesn't want to give out U.S. dollars for its program. It's yeah.
Yeah, I bet.
So you mentioned in sort of how lucky you were, both just from a like, hey, they actually happened to accept our first application for prototyping grant, even though that was the first application you had really done, and looking back on it, you're not as confident, like you're not as clear of like, hey, why did they accept this? I didn't know all of these tricks, right? And you mentioned that there were a lot of tips and tricks that you sort of find out through people who have gone through the process before and sort of know the dark arts. How did you get connected in a way with communities to try and learn that? Because like you're fresh out of school, you know that the CMF exists. How do you sort of build whatever network you did leading into that first application?
Leading into that first application. So at that time, to be fair, we had been part of an accelerator through Code Coven, so that helps on the resume. Um, but yeah, for that first application, I think we just wrote it to the best of our ability. We didn't even get anybody else to really review it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but since getting it, it's really been through the help of in so where the studio is based in Edmonton, there's an organization that will essentially give you a stipend to go to international events,
Hmm.
and that was huge for us because we would go and we'd have a couple of friends that we knew from industry, but very not that many, and so they would get us in conversation, be like, "Oh, hey, these guys got CMF. These guys are from Quebec. They have information."
Yep.
Also, something that's massive for myself and my other co-founder, with whom we like split the biz dev work, so we're both francophone.
Mm.
So it really helps to get into those rooms and get close with those people, and for that information to start flowing. Um, and yeah, that's really just being able to get out of Edmonton, which is again where the studio is based, and go meet with some of those people directly at events was probably why we're here today.
So now looking back, right, like you've gone on this journey, you sort of learned from the first application, you successfully did the second application, not just prototyping, but also the production funding. And you've built these contacts, you sort of have learned some of the dark arts of Canadian bureaucracy. When you think about folks who might be listening to this podcast who are thinking about starting a studio today, they're like where you were when you were thinking about doing it part time or even starting to do it part time and thinking about, okay, how do we get this funding for full time? What advice, both a little bit on the like thinking about CMF or grants in general side, but also just in general, the like leap into starting the founding journey. What advice, what is the biggest piece of advice you would give to that person starting out?
I think it's twofold. One is just reach out to people that have already gone through the journey that you're about to embark on. Um, I think for the most part, unless you're bothering someone right before release, is more than willing to share how it went for them. Um, and the second part is finding good co-founders with whom you really get each other. Um, I've talked to a lot of other founders, and you can tell the ones that don't necessarily have another co-founder that they like can commiserate with or share the load with, and how much stress it takes on them. So I feel very lucky to have like a partner in crime for especially the business side of things, because that stuff is a bit more esoteric. Uh, to really like go through it together.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah. And is also a very good segue to my questions about co-founders. Thank you for teeing us up on that one.
Oh, okay.
Um, so take us through, like you've mentioned, when you were part time, there was a larger group, then that sort of whittled down just as like the time and commitment and all that kind of stuff passed. And now it sounds like you have a relatively tight group. But what is the makeup of the co-founder group and team?
So right now, the whole team is four people. So three co-founders and one employee. And the makeup is you have myself as biz dev slash programmer. You have one person that's our producer, sound designer, and he's really the one handling everything admin related. And then you have our artist and uh, game designer. The employees are on the marketing slash community management side of things. Um, but yeah, that's the makeup. Obviously, especially big decisions, we all make together, making sure we're all on the same page on that. But yeah, that's the makeup.
And talk to me about how that group came together as the co-founders. It sounded like it was part of a larger group. Was is this just the three people who are left who have a really strong bond, and so that's just why those are the co-founders, or was there an intentionality around this is the right mix of co-founders, or how did that sort of like how do you feel about that process of going from part time to full time and the transition of who was on the team into now the three co-founders?
I feel pretty good about it. I will say a lot of it had to do with luck. The other people that left because of different priorities and
Mm-hmm.
time commitments and whatnot. But as far as how we ended up with this mix, that also somehow kind of lines up the different disciplines that we need for the game is really just luck. We happen to be the people that were around when this news of full time came up that could actually like action on that. And so I think that's also what helped us make that decision going back to the now's the time, because it's like, okay, well, the team is smaller, but we do technically cover all the disciplines, or a lot of the major disciplines that we'll need here. So this makes this a really good opportunity. If back then it would have been a team of like just three programmers or three artists, then like I might have felt different about it possibly. Uh, but being able to have this spread also makes that opportunity even more golden. So yeah, it really was luck. We met out of university, but it was luck that it kind of, at least we ended up with that final group.
Hmm. Tell me about that meeting through university, right? Because I think there's a lot of different forms that that can take, and I'm sure that there's a lot of students or recent graduates who can think back over classmates and club mates and all this kind of stuff. But to go from meeting through school to working part time on a thing to now co-founders, where did those original bonds come from, and how did that sort of turn into this let's do it sort of part time?
Mhm. Yeah, so we all came out of the University of Alberta, um, where one of the founders essentially met all of us through. There's a game design program or certificate. It's a set of courses. Some you make a game, some it's just game design, etc. But essentially, as he was going through those classes, he found other people that he found would align well with his values, as well as he was picking the like skill sets that were needed here, that were missing from the team, and that's how the original group got formed. Um, yeah.
That's awesome. And as you sort of went from doing this part time, folks had to move on for different priorities and different reasons, and sort of the natural attrition of time on projects, right? How did you have the conversations to figure out, yes, we want to go full time, and yes, these are the right people to go full time with?
I think because from the start we had, or the original co-founder had brought on all these people based on values. You already had kind of a feeling that these people are, aligned with yourself on how to go about this business. And then because we had been doing it part-time for a number of years, we also could get a decent sense of each other, of what you like or don't like about these other people, and if that's like a blocker on this whole thing. So then when essentially the CMF offer came in, it was very much a like, let's talk amongst ourselves. Essentially, we kind of need everybody to be in to do it, but if not, then like it starts that awkward conversation of, well, you're a co-founder, maybe you don't want to be part of this adventure, maybe another one. Uh, but luckily, in our case, as we were wherever we were in our career, it just kind of turned out that like the three of us that stuck around were kind of open to that opportunity. And because we had worked together before, like I was saying, we had a sense of, are these the people that I want to try and do this thing with? Which at the time, because you don't know what what starting a company is like until you're in it, seemed like, well, it's just another school project, and this CMF thing is just going to be 1 year. So like, why not? Let's see what happens. School project. I'm exaggerating, but like, you don't know exactly how deep the rabbit hole goes until you start going down it. And so we did, and it turned out well. It could have very well not, but it just worked out this time. Um, but yeah.
So you mentioned that like on important decisions, you and the other two co-founders sort of come together to make those decisions and make sure that you're all aligned and on the same page. How do you do that? And how do you specifically sort of deal with disagreement in that group? Like, not necessarily like
When I say disagreement, it's not necessarily like, oh, you're fighting, but more just like, hey, we don't all align immediately on the same answer. How do we hash it out, right? Like, how does that sort of take shape with your group of co-founders?
Yeah, obviously there's different types of decisions, and where analytics could answer the decision, that's just what we're gonna listen to. But I guess for the harder questions where it's either gut feeling or direction that one person on the team believes in, but maybe not the others, um, we've had these hard discussions based on our personal values and whatnot. Uh, it's just we just hash it out in that, like, we talk about what makes me say uncomfortable with that decision, what or what I think doesn't really work for what we're trying to do. We've been very open about very personal topics when it comes to these things, just so we all understand each other's context, and we've just cultivated that kind of culture, at least you know, at our size, that that at least gets us a way into conversation. At the end, we if it has to come to that, we can take it to a vote. Um, but so far in our company's journeys, we haven't had a, luckily again, knock on wood, we haven't had a conversation topic that's explosive enough to have someone leave the table angry. Um, it's often things that are more like, well, okay, I don't think this will work out, but we can just try it and see what happens. I'll try not to be an asshole and be like, "Oh, I told you so" afterwards. Um, but just giving each other the room and space to, like, just try it. At the end of the day, that's how we've been learning so far. We've made a lot of mistakes along the way, but you know, you're not going to know until you try it. And then we try and document that kind of stuff, and as part of our newsletter, so that other people don't make those mistakes. So at the very least, we made that mistake, so somebody else doesn't have to. But yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about documenting in a newsletter.
Yeah, so part of when we started this whole thing, um, the thing that at the time, I'm sure people are still saying it, but it's figuring out your marketing early. And so part of that, and part of the Chris Zukowski methods and whatnot, is starting a newsletter. And so at the time, we're like, well, what do we even write about? Like, who are we to tell anybody about anything? I mean, we could tell people about our game, of course, but that's not enough content for a newsletter every month. Um, and so the first thing that started those topics was, oh man, I really wish there had been more documentation around CMF, because the information's out there. It's just either people are not saying it, or they're just not writing them down. Maybe, who knows what motivation they had. And so from that started the newsletter, where we try and add anything that might be interesting to other game devs, to our community that's following the game. Um, we'll split it sometimes between newsletter or blog post, because as we grow, I'm sure a portion of audience does not care about the business side of it versus the games. Um, so yeah, that's something that we want to do. Give back to the community. A lot of people were there to help us get to where we are. It only seems fair for us to try and pass it forward to anybody else who wants to try this thing.
And just normally I save this kind of stuff to the end, but since it's relevant, if someone was interested in that newsletter, where would they go to find it?
Yeah, you could just go to our website, calderainteractive.com, and just sign up there.
Cool. Let's move slightly into focusing a little bit more on you and your specific journey as a human on this founding roller coaster ride. What are the primary support structures you have for yourself as a founder?
Um, First and foremost, my other founders, um, from my company, but then um, my partner, friends and family, obviously, and other founders in the community. It's funny how even if we're going through different budgets or studio sizes, the problems are somewhat very similar. So it's always fun to get in a conversation and talk about this, and um, commiserate. When we were pitching, for example, for publishers, we would hear like we wouldn't hear no's, but we definitely hear a lot of like, "Oh, give us a shout when you're further along," which at the time we don't even know what that answer means, other than like, "Oh, they're super into it. We just got to keep at it and send them a build like in a month or two." And it's like, but then over time of hearing enough of this and talking to other founders, it's like, "Oh, that's how that works. That answer
Yeah,
doesn't really mean what I think it means." They're just keeping you on the hook, which is fair. Again, this is a business, but I didn't know that at the time. And so, yeah, just commiserating with other people about like even just talking, "Oh, how many rejections have you had?" And then you can laugh about it now because you were crying about it then. Um, so yeah, really just being able to commiserate with other people has been
yeah.
big.
One of the things that I've really enjoyed about hearing all sorts of different founder stories and journeys and different companies is exactly to your point. Like, whether it's VC funded or publisher funded or grants or, indie or bootstrapping, right? Like somehow so many of the problems are the same, right? Whether you have no employees or 20 employees or whatever, right? Like it's you're running into the same things where it's like, oh yeah, lawyers are expensive, but you need to pay for them, right? And oh god, QuickBooks is terrible, but there's not a great alternative. So,
Yep.
all this kind of stuff, right? And that's so what's so valuable about meeting a ton of other founders and building that sort of network for yourself is that you can laugh about it because you were crying about it
Right.
before.
Yeah. Something else that really has helped me in the past, because that's the other thing with this whole startup thing is at some point, multiple times probably, you'll run into an issue that you think is existential to the point of like, this is it. This is the make or break. And to be fair, sometimes it is. A lot of the time, it probably isn't. And, I feel like everybody's got to go through that one, and then you start having better perspective. Um, on like, well, at the end of the day, this is also a job, and it's a hard job, and I love what I do. But if tomorrow the company goes under, I'm not like on the street, right? So it's like you got to have that perspective once in a while. And I know some people might say like, "Oh, that means you're not passionate enough. You gotta want it that bad." But for me, honestly, it just allows me to breathe sometimes when I'm stressed, um, just to calm myself down. But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to have a lot of rationality in a lot of these decisions and recognizing that, hey, if I'm putting myself into an existential crisis where I'm triggering fight or flight all the time, then I'm not going to be particularly rational, right?
exactly. Yeah,
To your point, I don't think it diminishes the passion or the commitment. It just enables the decision making to be crisp, right?
yeah, exactly.
Amazing. So, what is the place where you feel like you don't have support that you wish you did?
That I wish I did. I don't really know about that. Yeah, I think in a way you could say like anything that fills the business gaps in terms of support. But honestly, at this point, I think like that side of things is in a good place, and if I wanted to, I have the confidence to find someone who can get me in touch with someone else. I think at this point, the biggest thing for myself is now that we are not in constant needing to find funding, um, it's focusing back on the mental health and taking care of myself, and perhaps trying not to make this whole thing my identity, which again, it's a big part of me. And anytime I go to like a dev event, I try to enjoy myself, but I can't quite turn off that part of my brain that's like, but you're also here networking and like, what's happening here? It's just like, no, I can't just be like, a kid just enjoying it. So yeah, so honestly, that's my current um, big goal now that we have the funding and we can breathe and we know the money's going to be here for 2 years. And knock on wood, we planned enough so that we have enough time to do it and more than enough time to do it. But right now, it's really focusing on the mental health side of things and being able to disconnect. the work-life balance.
Yeah, that is consistently a hard part of founding. I think that is very different than a normal job. Is when you're a founder, there's no real turning it off, right? And so
Yeah.
thinking about the overall journey. So like you've been on this founding journey for a while now. You went, out of school into part-time. You got the CMF funding. You went full-time. You got more CMF funding, and you've been going on this journey. Is there any sort of like part of the journey that you've found that you've consistently struggled with, or anything that you're like, hey, if you're thinking about going on this journey, really think about this component of your own personal journey? Because right, like, because there's the like overall founding of the business and the journey that you go on, but there's the like you, Mickael, journey that you've been on. And for someone who's listening and thinking about going this, or someone who's on the journey and sort of processing how they're dealing with the journey, is there anything that you're like, hey, in retrospect, I struggled with this for a long time, and here's how I think about it now that might help you? Maybe you're still struggling with it, but it's a new framework of thinking about it that you would pass on to someone who's on this journey as well.
That's an interesting question. Something I've struggled with that I would do differently, essentially. I think that's tough to say something that I haven't already mentioned, but going back to the like, just reach out to people. You don't know what you don't know, and so reaching out to people and talk about it, whether it's finding a mentor, which I guess in hindsight, I wish we had found specifically mentors to kind of guide us along the way. We got to where we are, and it's great. Um, but finding some of those mentors would have saved us a lot of stress. We managed to put ourselves in the right places and make the right connections. That all that fed into where we are now. Um, but I also remember the like stress that it was pitching to these publishers. And in hindsight, what we should have done is look into what publishers actually want right now. We're in a weird times for games funding, and honestly, in hindsight, we should have known that all those publishers would tell us come back later. Um, the reason I bring that up is because we'd get a piece of feedback from the publisher, and then we just like drop our proper roadmap to chase that feature that they told us about, and then we go back to them, which is later than we had even expected because we're still pitching all over the time. So it's just splitting our focus that way. That was really tough. But yeah, finding a mentor to tell you about the things that you just don't even know to ask for is probably would have been a huge help for us.
Let's talk a little bit about the future. You've secured funding. Even coming through in sort of answers you've given before, you're feeling pretty secure in your place. The dev of the project is paid for. You can breathe easy. You don't have to go out and actively fundraise right now. I feel very jealous of you being in that position as I stare down an upcoming fundraise. But talk to me a little bit about what do you see on the horizon, both, and I mean both really for yourself on this founding journey. You sort of mentioned like, hey, let me try to refocus a little bit on supporting my own mental health and having a balance of my identity tied up to the startup space and my own. But like, looking across the next 6 months, year, or 2 years, like, what do you see for yourself on the journey, on the horizon for the journey, and see for the studio?
Yeah, so for myself, it's really what I've already mentioned on the mental health side of things, and picking up some new hobbies that aren't just overthinking about everything in this business and ingesting information on how we could be running the business better. I have co-founders. We can split this task, and it doesn't have to be all right now. So for me, on the personal side, that's what it is. Um, for the studio, it's definitely more on the well. I did say that the development is funded, but now we got to figure out the marketing. People have to know about the game so we can sell a buttload of copies and I can afford a home. That'd be nice. Um, but more seriously, the other thing to think about for the company is the release date for our game is in 2026. So working backwards now, that means that when does the next project have to come up, and when do we have to start hitting the road again to like get a new game funded. I would love it that by the time this current game ships, makes enough money that we never have to go find money. But that would be a silly way to run the business. So, it's already thinking of like, how do we release this game successfully, but also let's already start thinking about doing this whole thing again, where we have to come up with a new game idea and start pitching it and doing all these things. And what does our company look like when we have a game that's in pre-production while there's one that's in production, while eventually when that game releases, well, we're going to need support. If it does well enough, then we're going to need DLC. There's all these like mounting things that it feels like the both the easy and very hard solution to that is, well, just got to staff up. But because we don't have that much fun, anyways. So horizon wise, it's really thinking of like, past this project, what does this company look like? Can we maintain a small size? Because we really like the small size. We don't want to have to like grow too much. But yeah, how to juggle all these new responsibilities of these things that, again, we didn't know to even think about knowing. So that's basically time to reach out to those mentors and ask them how to do this whole thing again.
So let me ask you the incredibly, like, this is my deepest joy, I have to admit, of the podcast, is to ask this incredibly unfair question. Let me ask you the deeply unfair question. It's the future. Who knows what happens with Caldera? Like, we can pretend that it's the beautiful exit. You're acquired. You're sitting on the beach for a while, or the less favorable one where unfortunately you have to close up shop. But regardless of what happens in the future, would you do this whole journey again? Would you go on a startup journey again?
Oh yeah, for sure. It is. Sometimes I remember when I was just an employee at a tech company, and whew, that was so easy. You get your paycheck 9 to 5 with like so many coffee breaks during the day, and it is great. But I also look back on it, and I don't think I've cared about what I do more than my current situation. Like, I work way more, but I love every bit of it, whether it's the business side of it, the marketing, all these like stupid things that you have to think about, but I love it way, 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 way more. Um, it's definitely harder, but until I have priorities like kids or things like that where I need a stable income, until that's the case, yes, I would definitely found another company.
So how I like to wrap up sort of the podcast is by asking a series of sort of lightning round questions that come from my own co-founder dating and how I would talk to co-founders about what starting a studio might potentially look like together. And it really comes from this place of I believe that the strengths and weaknesses of a studio are ultimately the manifestation of the strengths and weaknesses of the co-founders. And so trying to suss out what are each other's strengths and weaknesses early on was a big part of how I did co-founder dating. And so I'm going to ask you a series of questions and just sort of get the read on it. And the first one is, what is your superpower?
Oh, superpower. That's a good question. I don't know. That it's I don't want to sound pompous, but it's like I
It sort of
care too
forces you to be
much. Yeah.
pompous.
No, I'd say for me is that like I have an infinite amount of energy for going out and meeting people. And that definitely like shows itself in those networking occasions and whatnot. No matter what time of day it is, no matter if I've just put in 12 hours of work and now it's like go to a meetup, I am always down and always super interested to hear everybody's stories.
I need to hire you to play me at so I do not have an infinite amount of energy for that
I love
stuff.
it constantly.
Outside of your superpower, what are your biggest strengths?
Biggest strength, probably that I just consume video game industry news just constantly. Could be on the consumer side, it could be on the game dev side, podcasts, documentaries, just endlessly scrolling on Twitter for stats and stuff like that, or Blue Sky, or whatever. Yes, that's it. That's probably one of my biggest strengths.
Blue Sky is as of this week, is the newest game
That's
dev
true.
hangout.
That's true.
Cool. So what are your big weaknesses?
I think it's probably the same thing, that I'm probably
Terminally
doing way
online?
too much. Yeah. Terminally online would be all right if at least it was other interests, but it's just like so constantly. I'm on TikTok, but why am I on TikTok? Because I want to see how those metrics work and how other studios are doing it. It's like, I should probably chill out with how much I do that.
What are your stress reactions?
Oh, sorry. Actually, I, I can't not mention. Sorry, my other weakness is I really, really prefer weighing out all the options possible, which is impossible to do in this space, and that can lead me to be like, oh, okay, we just got CMF funding, and we're still dealing with the paperwork to get the money. But in my mind, I'm still like, but what if we kept pitching to publishers? Wouldn't that be an idea? Because then we'd have options. It's like, man, just go work on the game. Just stop like burning yourself out thinking about these like not non possibilities. Like it's just not worth it. And so I'm very lucky that my co-founder is there to be like, are you kicking the can down? Are you just overthinking it? I think you are. And I'm like, you're right. So he's also very good to call me out on these things.
That's awesome. So what are your stress reactions?
What do you mean by reactions? Like how I handle stress, or?
Yeah, how do you handle stress? Generally, what I mean by this is like, when under stress, how does your behavior in a work setting change, right? Like some people when they're stressed, they reach out for ways that they can control the situation and can sort of become more controlling. Some people, there's obviously people who have tempers, or they're just very they just have a lot less patience. Other people are like, don't talk to me, I need to go into my like cube of isolation to deal with the stress. Like, what are your stress reactions?
Yeah, that's probably more that last one for me. A lot of the stress reactions that we've had have been, if it's out of our control, then I'm generally just kind of like grumpy about it, but that's kind of it. When it's in our control, big deadline or whatever, then yeah, I definitely opt for that bubble. It almost like galvanizes me to like get it done, and then I move very fast, assuming that I don't have to be disturbed. Yeah, yeah, definitely galvanizing me to be heads down and just like, all right, let's get this work done. Like it's not this bottleneck of programming. It won't be on me. I'm just gonna get it done.
And I'll proactively explain this last one because I tend to get questions about it. But what are your upkeep needs? And what I mean by that is things, especially in a business or work sense, that you need to have happen, usually like from an external source to you, in order to like maintain sanity. So my example is, as I'm doing work, I need feedback on it when I do an iteration of work. So if I put together a spreadsheet or I send something off to lawyers, right, I will start to go insane if there's just radio silence. Someone needs to say like, here's feedback on that work, or at the very least, that was valuable, I read it, right? Like otherwise like Carl goes crazy. So do you have anything similar to that where it's like, I need this going on in my professional life, otherwise I start to go insane or lose motivation or whatever?
Yeah, that's fair. I'm fairly low maintenance. Just need to be watered once a day. And no, for me, yeah, I think for me it's basically just having someone on the other end of the team to that's just there, either to give me feedback, or the times where I do go stir crazy is if there's supposed to be someone, but maybe they're off for the day or they're on vacation or whatever, and I post something and it just goes quiet. Working remotely, especially if I don't get that sense back, then that's when I can get pretty stir crazy. Luckily, we have enough people so that we have a cycle for this. Whether it's even just meeting every morning, it really helps. And yeah,
Yeah, I find that like remote work is great in a lot of ways, but it will absolutely shine a giant spotlight on your upkeep needs more than anything else.
yeah, definitely. And I do also get the like in person thing from like going to, whether it's meetups or um, co-working sessions and stuff like that, where it's just good to get face to face with anyone really that's sort of working along on something that you're also in the same space as. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Amazing. Well, thank you for answering all my questions and joining us on the podcast. Is there anything here at the end of the podcast that you'd like to give a shout out to, or tell our listeners about, or anything like that?
Yeah, so we're releasing the Rabbit Hall in 2 years' time. In the meantime, our Steam page is up, collecting wish lists and whatnot. You can also join our Discord for playtests that we run every like 3 or so months, where we collect feedback from people and just be part of our community. But yeah, that's us.
Amazing. And if someone has listened to the podcast and is really curious about something you said, or wants to, as you said, reach out to you to build that network of founders and ask for advice, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Yeah, can find me on Twitter, Blue Sky, LinkedIn. If people are using that, there's a funny Venn diagram of people who still do, or straight to my business email, my first dot last name at calderainteractive.com.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Carl.
Thanks for listening to the entire episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends or anyone you think could benefit from it, and leave us a positive rating or subscribe. This episode was edited by Christopher Delano, music by Jake Hull, who's available for composer work in games. And if you're interested in learning more about the Game Founder support community, go to gamefounders.org or email me at carl@gamefounders.org. Thanks so much.